All right, let's review what we talked about today in class. We were looking at photosynthesis, and one of the first things we looked at was breaking this word down into its parts. Photo means light, and when we're talking about photosynthesis, we're talking about light typically from the sun, so sunlight. Anytime you see synthesis, it means to put together or to make. Now, if you combine those two, it doesn't really make sense to say making light or putting together light. But what we are doing is using light, and usually from the sun, using energy from that light to make something. And in this case, we're making sugars. Now, photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast, and this is something that we talked about when we were looking at cell parts. So I've drawn for you a chloroplast, and you should have this in your notes as well at this point. So remember that chloroplasts are found in plants. And now we're looking at a little bit more detail with chloroplasts. So one of the first things I want you to realize is that here you've got this outer membrane. Okay, so this outer membrane, this kind of oval type shape, really is what chloroplasts look like if that's all you could see. Within the outer membrane, you have the stroma. The stroma is the liquid that you find inside of chloroplasts. Okay, so that is the liquid. Remember that the liquid of cells is the cytoplasm, but the liquid inside inside the chloroplast, it has a much more specific word, and that is stroma. In addition, you see these little disc shapes, and they're all stacked. A single disc is called a thylakoid, and within this thylakoid is located a pigment. It's the pigment that makes plants appear green, and it is called, thinking of the wrong thing, it is called chlorophyll. And plants have other pigments as well that give them other colors, but that's the one we're more concerned with. That's the one that makes them appear green. Okay? When you have several stacks, or when you have several discs in a stack of the thylakoids, that's called a granum. So singular is granum, plural is grana, just so you are aware, because I'll be using those terms to mean those very specific things. So a single one of these stacks is a granum, multiple or plural is granum. Now, the next thing that we need to cover is the different sets of reactions that are part of photosynthesis and where they occur in the chloroplast. So the first thing we'll look at is the equation for photosynthesis. And this is something that you will just need to memorize. You need to know the equation for photosynthesis, and hopefully it isn't too difficult to remember, since most people know that plants need water, plants need carbon dioxide from the air, and that plants release oxygen. Okay, that's the oxygen that we breathe. The major thing that we can't forget about is this C6H12O6. That is the glucose that plants are making. That's the most important reason for doing photosynthesis. It's not the oxygen, it's this glucose. Okay. The first set of reactions are called the light reactions, and in this set of reactions, water is split, the oxygen is released, and ATP is made. Now, this is a very small amount of ATP. It's going to be used later in photosynthesis. But ultimately, we want all that energy that was stored in ATP to be stored in a more longer-lasting molecule, like glucose, which is a longer-lasting molecule. The light reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes. That is a detail you need to remember. Also recall that plants need water, and photosynthesis does occur in the leaves, the greenest part of the plant. And water has to somehow make its way up to the leaves. And the way it does that is through capillary action. We've already talked about that, so I suggest going back and reviewing that information. It's in the properties of water section when we were talking about cohesion and adhesion. Now, I've given you a little summary of what goes in and what comes out of each set of reactions in photosynthesis. So for the light reactions, what do we need? Sun and water. And what do we get? oxygen. This is the oxygen that we breathe, and it is the result of this water molecule being split. We also get hydrogens and ATP. Both the hydrogens and the ATP then proceed to the next set of reactions, the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is really just using that ATP from the light reactions to build sugar from carbon dioxide. So sugar is a very energy-dense molecule. It requires a great input of energy to be built. And that energy is going to come from the ATP. And remember, the ATP got its energy ultimately from the sun. The Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. Remember, that's that liquid area of the chloroplast. And when we look at the overall summary of what goes in, what comes out, you need ATP, CO2 to make these sugars finally. Now, remember that the sugars are then used by the plant to grow tall, grow big. It needs the sugars for energy as well. So we'll look at the next process in a minute where we're breaking down the sugars to release the energy that we just stored. But keep in mind that plants need ways of getting rid of certain things and bringing in certain things. So we know how plants bring in water. How do plants bring in CO2, and how do they get rid of oxygen? That is the job of little holes in the leaves called stomata. And they're on the underside of the leaf. And you do need to know this word, and you need to know what the function of stomata is, and that is just gas exchange. So CO2 is a gas, O2 is a gas. These gases are being exchanged through these tiny holes in the leaves. And when gases need to not be exchanged, there are guard cells that close the stomata. So keep in mind, I'm only mentioning it briefly, but you still do need to understand the function and the significance of all of these cells, of all of these parts in relation to photosynthesis. Make sure to check the other videos that I'm going to post regarding photosynthesis, some random videos from YouTube, and check the reference pages that I will post that are in your textbook.